We're back to our enablement building program. We're going to move on to the stages of learning. Let's move right into it. That first stage is the do stage. Do I want to go ahead and learn? But do I want to learn? That's a decision that has to be made. If it's not made, you automatically move into failure. Do I want to be successful? Do I want to learn? And that's a really important question to understand. Because if you don't, you automatically fail. Our little orange line is failure. It's moving away from success as our success line as we go forward. But that's the first stage. The next stage of learning is obviously how. How is a really interesting stage that some people don't take into account, but people make that conscious decision when they decide they want to learn. They do look at how they're going to learn it, and they locate that knowledge. They consciously or subconsciously make a decision on, is this going to be the effective knowledge I need in order to move forward? They evaluate the reward. Is it worth it? Is my level of effort going to give me the right amount of reward in order for me to get what I want? Or is my level of effort too high, right? And that's a decision people have to look at the how stage. But ultimately, they have to decide if they want to proceed. If they don't, right, they fail. So the learn stage is where a lot of people believe learning happens, but there's, the 5 stages that go through this. But ultimately, this is where the person consumes the information, right? The individual will learn. They'll go to university, they'll go to college, they will apprentice, they will study on their own, reflect, whatever the case may be, but they will learn whatever it is that they're going to learn. And they're going to learn it through their own desired discomfort, which we're going to get to, not their learning preference, but the right amount of discomfort, because ultimately they have to digest that information. If they don't digest that information, they fail, because the next stage is the test, right? And think about this however you want. The test is projects, thesis, written work, but usually in every learning environment, besides once the career has started, which we'll get to here in a second, learning, there is usually a test that actually happens. And that's a Boolean, right? It's a true or false, pass or fail. But the testing stage is usually in place. And in most cases, if people do not pass that test, their success line across the top stops and they fall back out. And then they may have to go back and look at new hows or learns, but they're going to have to figure it out if they're going to want to proceed to the point where they pass. But then there's this final stage, which a lot of organizations overlook when they're building their enablement program, especially the client enablement program. And that is around execute. And the execute is the final stage, right? Learning to not utilize it is useless in a high utilitarian's mindset, right? Like if you're going to learn something, it's for practicality. It's so that you can utilize that knowledge and execute it. And that's really what the execute stage is. You take the knowledge, however you've consumed it, and you execute on the learnings. You apply them. You apply those learnings. Now, there's two other there's a lot more things there's a lot additional variables that pop into the execute stage, but here we're going to talk about, there is one that we refer to as the assessing the unique variables. So after you've taken that knowledge, you have to assess what is unique to how you've been able to apply that knowledge before. That's a big place of failure for a lot of folks. They this is the analyst or the high analyst in our trimetrics report, somebody that falls in the analyst quadrant, that does a lot of research, a lot of studying, but because they look up based off history and learnings, it's really hard to apply the practicality and the unique variables. Now, we looked at that in our profiles yesterday, but assessing the unique variables, pandemics, recessions, 2008, I know exactly where I was when the recession happened, but understanding and how to assess the unique variables, building a new vertical, building a new segmentation, assessing the unique variables is the harder part of executing on the learning stages, because you have to execute in the real world. Another thing that we heard in last month's session that I thought was really interesting is somebody brought up the point of, as you go through those stages, you are normally with like-minded people. And I thought that was a really beautiful point. And that goes out to Cameron from last month. But Cameron was absolutely right. If somebody's made the decision, yes, and they've chose to go through the same process to learn as you, even in your workshops, in your environments, in your learning environment, you're very like-minded. And the test pass stage and all of that, you feel very, very comfortable. So in that environment, your communication skills are probably quite strong because people think very similar to you in that environment. When you move into the execute stage, and let's use the term the career, or where you're applying that knowledge and you're applying it into a career, or you're applying it towards your work environment, the communication is with individuals that are usually not like-minded, especially if you're in a team or a department. So learning to understand that as we go through this is really, really going to be interesting. Because if you can't do the bottom two variables, even if you can execute your learnings, but you cannot assess the unique dynamicness of the current environment, of the current situation, which is that assessing unique variables, and then communicate with people who don't think necessarily that's where the success of those learnings and the stages of learnings will also fail. So we're going to talk about IQ, and it's pretty simple. The modern definition of it is the ability to learn, right? And problem solving. We can get into it, but let's just agree for the time being that it's the ability to learn. So at those stages, at the do I want to learn, there's really not a huge amount of flexing of learning at that stage. It's a decision, and usually that's made of other variables. You may be intrigued to learn, which is more motivation, which we'll get to in a second. But the IQ is not really needed at that stage. The how, though, on the other hand, you start to flex the IQ, right? You'll do research, you'll do learnings and learning how to learn. So you're actually using your IQ at a really, really high level. Now, when you get to that learn stage where you are learning your content and you are learning, through whatever means it was, apprenticing, mentoring, school, workshops, continued education, however it goes, watching your favorite, video, social teacher weekly, or watching, reading Harvard Business Review, or, wherever it is, you're always learning. You're still flexing that IQ. If you're digesting the information, right? There may not always be the test, which we're going to talk about, but really the IQ it's been proven it's not used at the testing stage anymore. You're not learning anymore. You're learning up to the point you're done studying, maybe, but when you're recalling, you're just recalling that information, which, there is an argument to be made around the IQ there, but realistically, if we're keeping to the definition of the ability to learn, it falls away. But when we move into execute, even if you don't learn anything else from school directly, you still are going to execute those learnings, right? You're going to execute them. And if, if you've done residency, which is my favorite type of learning when you look at the medical profession, right? Because they actually execute, and part of the testing is in the real world scenario in the residency part. So they have to learn to communicate. They have to do assessing of variables in real world scenarios and everything. That's why residency and lawyers and other, when you actually do stages of progression before you finally get your partnership in a firm, or in this particular case, you become a full-fledged doctor after you graduate, it's because you practiced in that execute stage. So that one's unique. But in all others scenarios, or not all others, but in most others, the IQ is flexed based on learning the new variables, assessing the new variables, learning. So the IQ will have to be flexed, but it's not as high as everybody believes. EQ is an interesting one, and we really have to call it out because it's the most overlooked when people are building out their enablement programs. And everyone who was here last Thursday will know my frustration with EQ, especially people who have low EQ building sales enablement programs, but we'll move on. So just a quick refresh. EQ falls into a lot of different direction. When you ask people, how's your EQ? Everybody says it's great. And the simple truth is it is great in most likely one area, but EQ is broken down and again, up for debate, but for today, we're going to refer to it as others and self. Those are going to be the two borderlines. Your EQ has to do with others and your EQ has to do with self, but their first part of the EQ is the awareness. So self-aware. Are you self-aware enough to be able to see your own actions? Are you self-aware enough to know when you are not right or know when you are right? And self-aware. Are you self-aware enough to know your own emotions, what you're feeling? Are you in the primal part of your brain, fight, flight, or freeze? Are you in the mammal or the emotional part of the brain, right? With high emotion, right? And that part, are you in the logical side, the frontal? We're getting too deep here, but your awareness is really necessary based off self. Now, the other side of the EQ is, do you have others, awareness of others? Now, that's where somebody believes you see the other flip of the coin. Some people are like, oh, my EQ is great. I can always read other body language and so forth. And some people really can't, but maybe their self is off from an awareness. And that's one dimension of your EQ. When we move into the other side, it's the regulation, right? So you may have great awareness, but you may not have regulation, something that I have always loved to struggle with myself. But the ability to say things at times because you feel the information is very, very important. That's a self-regulation issue that people have to, some people struggle with. I'm one of those folks. And then you move into others. And your EQ is, how do you regulate around others versus how do you regulate around yourself? That regulation is really, so social regulation versus self-regulation. Very different. And again, certain people are very strong and certain people struggle. So when people say they're strong at EQ, and again, this isn't an EQ presentation, it's on learning stages, but you're learning yourself. Also, the other part of your EQ is your motivation, and motivation is self. Others can impact it, especially if they have no vision or if you can't follow them effectively, but your motivation, and this is really going to be important for our enablement program, your motivation has to be really around the individual. Okay. So back to that learning, the IQ piece, let's layer over the EQ now. So if we move into it, and we're just going to refer to this as the EQ and what you need for the ability to learn from EQ at different stages. And do I want to learn? There's a lot of models out there that actually refer to that part being the higher part. That is a higher amount of them. This is probably about 50%. This is on a scale of 1 to 10, which there really should be a scale on this, but it's like at a 5, right? You really have to make a decision. Your EQ has to be your social or your self-awareness has to be enough to decide that you're going to have to do something. Then you have to be motivated enough to actually decide, yeah, I'm going to do it. Right. So the EQ actually is quite high. The how, same thing. It's you're calling people, you're working with others in a lot of cases, you're finding information, especially people with high EQ, they'll lean into others before they'll lean into maybe their own information research because they, anyhow, it's a different talk for a different conversation. But the point is EQ is still used. When it comes to learning, it's obviously not as high as the IQ is going to be. The learning component, or you don't need that part of your brain. You don't need that emotional side of your side to learn necessarily. The motivation still has to be high. You have to be motivated to continue to learn. So that part of your, EQ, but self-regulation has to be high. Depending on the learn environment, traditional sitting down, self-regulation or social regulation, like that part's going to have to be high. Apprenticing, mentoring stuff, maybe you'd actually use more EQ because you have to read others and learn from others in different ways. But again, the models show that it's fairly low. The testing, it's actually higher than the IQ draw now, which we'll show as we overlap the next model. But again, it's more along the motivation side of testing well and being prepared. Usually the EQ is self-regulating anxiety, right? High anxiety will continue to go. Self-regulation and self-awareness will actually regulating that anxiety is the flex of EQ usually. But now this is the really interesting one. And this is, again, when you see people who, and it hurts leaders when they have people who have, gone off, got their bachelor's, and then they get their MBA, and they've never really had any practical execution experience until they've kind of come to work for the first time. They've done some internships and so forth, but then they start to execute. And then when they have to look at, they can execute their learnings because they're extremely good at learning. But with the execution, that last stage, the assessing the unique variables. And, the assessing the unique variables, I'm just going to back this up real quick here so everybody gets an understanding of this. Apologize, but I want everybody to see this. Sorry, we're going back so far. But if you look at the assess unique variables and the communicate, this is what the big EQ draw is, okay? So again, I apologize, I'm clicking through this so much. But if we fly back to this, you'll see that you need both. First of all, you need to be intelligent because you have to be able to learn, but the real intelligence can only be amplified and can only be utilized if you really think this flattens out. If you don't have the ability to execute the EQ piece, if they're not motivated enough to execute, if you're not motivated, well, and I think back to some use cases where, and this is what we do in the, when with the psychologists and our psychiatrists that come in and social workers and our behavioral experts, they help our folks that are really high in one aspect of their EQ, but they're struggling in other aspects. It's to allow people to see how to assess the variables. People who learn really, really well love to learn, and learning comes based off history, and looking forward and applying that practical knowledge and unique variables is sometimes tricky. Again, it's usually come down to an EQ of being able to communicate with people in an effective way to be able to get the information, because you don't need all the answers. What you need is that team that has all the answers, right? So back to building out our enablement program for our clients, we have to be taking in all of these accounts. Right? Do we influence our clients enough to want them to learn the way that we want them to understand? Do we provide the level of discomfort, which we're moving into here, the desired discomfort, the right environment for them to be receptive enough to want to learn and evaluate easy enough? Will they learn? The test we'll discuss if it's necessary, because actually we're looking at practicality really, really quickly. And maybe there is this process of residency application that we can put in play that allows people to execute in the real world environment with the people they're going to have to execute with, so that we can teach them as we go through the enablement how to assess the unique variables of their company to our application and how we're applying it. And two, learning how to communicate with everybody effectively throughout this process. So that has to be part of our enablement program for our clients to adopt our solutions. So let's take a break, and then we'll move into building it.